Good afternoon, everyone. This is Abby from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us today for Webinar Wednesday with the Strengthening Tribal Response to Violence Against Native Women initiative. We'll begin the webinar soon, but we're going to wait a few more minutes to allow others to finish logging in. Please note that the line will remain silent until we begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for Webinar Wednesday. My name's Abby with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and I just want to go over some quick tips before we begin today's webinar. I know that most of you have attended webinars in the past and are familiar with the control panel on the right, but here are a quick few reminders. Once you call into the meeting line, be sure to enter your PIN number. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Your control panel will show on your user screen for the duration of the webinar. To minimize the control panel, use the orange arrow in the top left. Use the question box on the control panel to submit questions and responses. We will have time at the end of the webinar for any questions. You will find all relevant documents referenced in this webinar in the handout section. There's also a PDF to the PowerPoint slides to follow along. All the materials and a link to the video will be emailed to all attendees following the webinar. Today's webinar is hosted by the Strengthening Tribal Response to Violence Against Native Women initiative and will focus on fundamentals of advocacy in tribal communities. I will now turn it over to Lana Hunter to begin today's webinar.
Thank you, Abby. My name is Lana Hunter, and I'm from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate Nation in Sisseton, South Dakota, and also from the Tlingit Nation in Southeast Alaska. I have been an advocate for ending violence against Native women for over 20 years and have worked at state, tribal, and also federal levels to work on policy as well as funding and additional opportunities to provide safety for Native women and children. I am happy to be hosting this along with my colleague, Bonnie Claremont, who will introduce herself in just a few slides. We are going to talk a little bit about the initiative itself. Can I have the next slide? Next slide. So the initiative is led by the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and we have partners who also partner along with us with the Office on Violence Against Women. This is actually a new initiative within the last few years, and looking at those tribes who do not receive Office on Violence Against Women funding, and it addresses baseline safety precautions, measures, and looks at how we can provide that on a grassroots level as well as within our tribal communities and in times with multi-jurisdictional responses as well. Next slide.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bonnie Claremont, and I'm co-presenting this webinar with Lana today, and I am a citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation, originally from Wisconsin. I live here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I've been with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute for about 15 years, but prior to that, I was an advocate for many years. And I'm really excited today to do this presentation on advocacy, because as we know, according to the data, and I sometimes think that the data is really not accurate because, you know, there's a lot of violence that happens that doesn't get reported, that's really never shared with anyone because of the barriers that exist. So part of this initiative is really addressing some of those barriers and removing them in order to create safe space where victim survivors of any kind of violence, particularly domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, sex trafficking, feel a little more confident that if they report that, you know, they won't be re-victimized, that they'll receive support, you know, better yet, even an advocate, and all those systems, folks will respond in a compassionate way, in an appropriate way. So what we have is some data before you, and this data reflects that 56.1% of American Indian Alaska Native women have experienced sexual violence, and 55.5% have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner, and this is out of the National Institute of Justice report. And also, we see the statistic that 24.5% of American Indian Alaska Native women have experienced stalking during their lifetime. And we look at the murder rate, which is 10 times higher than the rest of the nation as it affects Native women. You know, I always say that when I train, it's kind of like we're the most often raped, the most often battered, the most often physically assaulted, the most often trafficked, the most often missing and murdered. So it really becomes critical that we come together and look at what we're able to do within our tribal communities by exercising our sovereign rights, by really increasing or improving the response that our relatives who are being assaulted, what they need, especially children that witness the violence, children who are taken from their families through trafficking and so forth. So this is an awesome initiative that the Office on Violence Against Women has created to help those tribes who may not receive or who aren't receiving OVW funding to receive some help, to receive some training and technical assistance. So I'll be talking to you more about advocacy and how it fits with the work that we're doing. Next slide.
So this initiative, along with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, includes critical partners who provide training and technical assistance throughout Indian country. And our partners include the Tribal Judicial Institute, that is their website and link located there on the screen, the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, and they really work with us to partner with tribes in Alaska to provide Alaska-specific and culturally specific technical assistance as well as materials and trainings. We also have the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence, and this is the alliance of the 19 tribal coalitions that exist throughout the United States. Not every state has a tribal coalition, but at least 19 have a conglomeration of programs that serve women and children throughout the state, which would include domestic violence, sexual assault, dating, stalking violence, as well as, in some cases, sex trafficking. So you can visit their website to learn more about the tribal coalitions. And this initiative is the tribalresponse.org, and I'll share a little more of those resources, as well as the organization that Bonnie and I work for, which is the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, located in the middle of your screen. Next slide. It was also important to include direct service providers to review materials as we were setting up the initiative. So we have a partnership with the Amonic Shelter located in Amonic, Alaska, as well as the Great Seminole Nation of Oklahoma Domestic Violence Program, and the Native Alliance Against Violence, which is located in Oklahoma. The Native Alliance Against Violence is also one of our tribal coalitions. Next slide. So the training resources and technical assistance that we have available is limited to a few key areas that provide safety and offender accountability for ending violence against Native women and children. So the topics that we provide training and technical assistance on, I think you have to hit enter. Coordinated community response, as well as the Bonnie does provide information on sexual assault response teams as well. In addition, we have shelter and safe housing, and that's really looking at sustaining shelter and safe housing, as well as the understanding how to set up the tribal shelter and safe housing with policies, procedures. We will be doing a webinar for February that will be sending out information about how to have victim-centered policies located in your shelter, and we also provide information on advocacy in tribal communities and the role of advocates, as well as explaining various roles that advocates can take on, such as law enforcement, grassroots, as well as prosecution or victim witness advocate through the victim witness office or the Attorney General's office at the federal level. We also have legal response focusing on tribal protection orders, and this is really very specific legal focus that we have in order to ensure that we're not providing a plethora or a ton of legal responses. We have focused on tribal protection orders, again, as the baseline safety for offender accountability as well as victim safety. And this is really critical when we're talking about multi-jurisdictional responses to tribal protection orders. Oftentimes there may be issues or legalities concerning enforcement of those tribal protection orders. In some cases, we've seen that it can occur at a county level and or a state level. So we tried to provide training and technical assistance to respond to in order to enforce those tribal protection orders. Next slide. And we also have additional resources which are located on the website, which is listed below, www.tribalresponse.org. Next slide. So I would say probably a question that folks have is who can receive training and technical assistance, and is there a cost? You can press enter. So the opportunity for this training and technical assistance is provided through the Office on Violence Against Women, and it was really to respond to those tribes, of which there are 563 tribes throughout the United States, and I would estimate that at least less than 20% of the tribes are receiving direct grant funding from the Office on Violence Against Women. And for that reason, they have offered this free training and technical assistance or no cost to you that will allow for you to build these infrastructures, capacity, responses that center around each of the topics that I've outlined. So there is no cost for this if you currently do not receive Office on Violence Against Women funding. And if you're not sure, you can contact our training and technical assistance, which we will highlight at the end, to contact us to see if you are a qualifying tribe. We also have a request form for training and technical assistance that is located on our website, and I will also highlight additional opportunities to contact us at the end of the webinar. Next slide. I will turn it over to Bonnie.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Anna. So today, the focus of today's webinar is, advocacy in tribal communities, and it's really looking over the fundamentals of advocacy. And you want to just scroll down? So today, what I want to do is provide just a brief historical overview, perspective of advocacy, where it came from and where it originated, and also want to discuss with you and share with you what a really good definition of what is an advocate that's been around for a while, but I think within tribal communities I think it's really applicable, and also share with you the different types of advocacy. As Lana mentioned earlier, there are a couple of different types of advocacy, and also just review some of the basic roles of advocates when working with victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, and dating violence. These are the primary crimes that we're addressing with this OVW funding. And then we'll also take a look at some of the critical responsibilities of advocates to just, again, review them and then share some resources with you. But I also want to say that this particular webinar, of course, doesn't replace the training that I believe that advocates really need. And there's 40-hour training opportunities available. I know the Minnesota Indian Women Sexual Assault Coalition has a 40-hour training on sexual assault advocacy. And I believe Redwin also has some advocacy training. An organization in Colorado. So this webinar is really to provide an overview of advocacy and part of our training, on-site training for tribes that don't receive OVW funding, and we're going to be doing some regional training. So some of this information will also be shared within our regional training. So it's sort of just to give an overview of the role of advocates, which I think, it's really important that tribes look at creating tribally based, community-based advocacy programs that can incorporate the key elements of our tribal traditions within those advocacy programs, because as we know it, advocacy programs in mainstream don't always meet the needs of our relatives that are needing help because of the assault that they've experienced. They need to feel comfortable. They need to feel like they're understood. So I think that, we really want to work with tribes to empower or exercise their sovereignty, I guess, to create these tribally based and culturally appropriate programs such as advocacy programs and shelters. Next slide. So looking at the historical perspectives of advocacy, advocacy is not a new thing. It's not a new phenomenon that, we've sort of encountered. We've had, our aunties from way back who were probably some of the toughest, strongest advocates that anyone could have, right? Aunties who stood up for us, aunties who went to bat for us if something, someone did us wrong. And also our grandmas and our moms and our allies with the men as protectors. So advocacy, I don't think, is anything new. It's just terminology. And especially in tribal nations where we were, there's evidence that the majority of our tribal nations were matrilineal in terms of our social structures. And within those tribal nations, women were considered sacred and really held their the autonomy over their bodies, over their belongings, over their space, and also protected that for others, especially for their children. So women were really central figures in terms of family, protecting their family harmony, their homes, and their villages. So, we had a lot of women's societies, I guess you would call them, where women really gathered and came together to provide support to one another in difficult times. And they often fought right along with the men as needed. So women were considered very sacred, very connected to the earth, very connected to the water and the resources of the earth. So, it's always been my contention that the stronger the women, the stronger the tribal nation. So it's kind of in everyone's best interest that women are protected, and also children, because they're the future of our people. Can you scroll? So there was a lot, as we know, the late 60s and 70s was sort of that era of self-determination, where we started to see a lot of sort of an upsurge in communities of color who were, demanding their equal rights, demanding equality at all levels. And this same upsurge happened as far as women organizing and speaking out about violence that was happening in their communities and in their homes. And the same happened within our communities, because along with some of the activist organizations that were happening back then, women were involved in those, but also it was really closely linked to looking at the root causes of domestic violence, sexual assault, and so forth. And women clearly saw that there was some connection to gender inequality, oppression, and so forth, and really wanted to create some change within their communities and how women were being treated and the lack of resources. So, our current advocacy model, I don't know what else to call it, but our advocacy model really, came from that experience, came from that history of women coming together, oftentimes even in private homes around kitchen tables, to say, we all know this is a problem and we all need to, what can be done about it. And oftentimes women would open their own homes to other sisters, other relatives that were experiencing the violence in their home, to create safe space. But also there was always that underlying importance of addressing social and system change work, so that it's really not just applying a Band-Aid, but looking at what are the causes of this domestic violence and this sexual assault, and how can we address those root causes. But it was also based on the need to provide safety and empowerment for women who are being assaulted, and also for better accountability. When you look at what needs to change, attitudes need to change, how we relate to one another needs to change, so that, again, there's equality. There's that central understanding that women are sacred, and that understanding needs to be, interdepartmental, interagency, and really, again, it's kind of like reclaiming our tribal traditions, our tribal way of thinking and relating to one another as relatives. So that's what makes us inherently different when we look at advocacy from a tribal perspective, that it's different. It's different because it really speaks to who we are and how we relate to one another, and the need to protect ourselves from the root causes of the violence. So the social and system change pushed for change in attitudes about gender equality, and also looked at policy and legislative changes at all levels. So it took a lot of a grassroots movement to create even what's today called the Violence Against Women Act. One of the first conferences I went to, there was a little handful of Native women. This was in the early 90s, and I know that there was Native sisters in every tribe and every community that were doing this work, but weren't visible there in Washington, D.C. at that particular instance. So there was a few of us that came together and said, we need to be a part of this. And that kind of grassroots work is really at the center of the work that we've done as far as advocacy is concerned, and continues to be with a lot of our sisters, working for legislative change and policy changes as well. So that the 1994 Violence Against Women Act was really kind of the impetus, or it gave us a lot more resources within tribal communities, especially through the Tribal Governments Program, which provided more funding and resources to tribes to develop programming to address violence against Native women, which is amazing. And from there also tribal coalitions sprung up that we see that Lana talked about, having 19 tribal coalitions. It's not anywhere near enough. We need so many more to address the problem, especially today with the problem of sex trafficking that's getting more widespread attention. Next slide. So overall, I just want to say that ending violence against women and all other forms of violence lies in our ability to reclaim our roles and responsibilities as relatives. And that's, I think, something that we can all understand and relate to. We all have roles and we have responsibilities on how.
Hi everyone, we're just having some technical difficulties. Bonnie's calling back in, it'll just be 1 minute.
Hello? Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. I didn't touch the phone and I got disconnected. So as I was saying, advocates role model the sacred connection in terms of how we model support to our relatives, our sisters, how we model leadership, how we model, working to create changes in attitudes about why violence against women happens. And we start that with our own families, with our own children, with our own kinship network, so that those attitudes can change, because those are at the root cause of violence against women. And also how we relate to one another. Those kinds of things become apparent, especially in a shelter setting, for example, to have that welcoming kind of an environment where we may have the ability to smudge. We have a safe place where women can gather and visit and cook, and just the way that our aunties and our relatives did it. Those are the differences in terms of how we develop our advocacy programs within tribal communities. It's really about making those connections and relationship building, and relying on our tribal traditions that are really based on family and kinship roles. Next slide. So this was a definition that was developed out of the Mending the Sacred Hoop back in 1996. And I use this often in my training just because I think it really, for me, speaks to advocacy, the role of the advocate. It's to act as the biased supporter. We are biased. We are biased, 100% biased. What happens often with victim survivors is when they when they share their experience with someone, either they may not be believed, or there's some skepticism about what happened, or maybe we're not believing the full story, or but as an advocate, our role is to be the bias supporter. We're 100% biased with the woman that we're working with. And we advocate for the expressed interest. So we don't assume that she wants any particular service that we're able to provide her. It's really about giving her information, giving her accurate information about the services that are available either within our organizations, out in the community, so she can make informed decisions, informed choices about what she wants and what she doesn't want. And we all know that the underlying motive for domestic violence is about power and control. So our role as an advocate is really to, restore that power and control, that autonomy back to the woman that we're working with. So we do that in terms of allowing or enabling or empowering her to make her own choices. So we wait for her to let us know, expressing her interests, before we make any kind of assumptions that she wants particular kinds of services. And safety of women and their children, including safe space. Again, creating that safe space within our organizations. And what does that mean? That means that we operate from a victim-centered perspective, that we operate from a perspective that she feels comfortable within, that we have the safeguards needed, even in terms of the location of our programs. Are we closely located to where there may be a lot of traffic from batterers? We may want to rethink that. I visited a community where they had victim services just down the hall from a courtroom where they were hearing a lot of cases where there was a flow of traffic of batterers. So even the proximity of where our offices are located is really important. And other resources to regain control over their lives. And again, working with our partners to ensure that they too have a victim-centered response, or that they're aware of what that means, so that perhaps there can be some cross-organization or cross-agency training where we can provide training to other organizations that come in contact with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And to provide leadership and expertise based on women's experiences within justice, law enforcement, social service, and medical systems. Again, we're about that systems change, where we're wanting to help people understand what this person is going through, what they're wanting to achieve, their the goals that they have. And there's a lot of organizations and a lot of systems that this battered woman, for example, has to encounter, and oftentimes that can be pretty daunting for victim survivors of any type of abuse, that even one system, having to interface with any one system, such as law enforcement, for example, can be really intimidating, maybe a little frustrating, or maybe even scary for a victim of violence. So it's really important that we work closely with our tribal and non-tribal agencies to ensure that they are willing or able to provide a victim-centered response. And lastly, to prioritize women's safety and offender accountability. I think the two just go hand in hand, that we as advocates need to continue to look at that. What is it going to take for us to create and prioritize women's safety in all aspects of, where they live and in the community and so forth, and also to have that response in place with agencies like the courts and probation and domestic violence batterer re-education programs, so that we're all working together to create safety in all aspects of the work, including maintaining confidentiality, which is, to me, a cornerstone of safety. In our tribal communities, they're fairly small. So issues like or factors such as confidentiality and privacy all become a hallmark to ensuring women's safety, because that's oftentimes why women say they don't want to report or seek help, because they don't want the word to get out. They don't trust that their information is going to be kept confidential. So it's really up to us to ensure that by policies and protocols. Next slide. Scroll down. There are two different types of, there's several types of advocates, but there are two in categorized under. One is community-based, which is tribal, nonprofit, or independent organization, an autonomous organization. And there's also the system-based, where an advocate is assigned within the Bureau of Indian Affairs or within the U.S. Attorney's Office when a case is being charged out. So there's two different types. And we look at training factors in a community-based advocacy program. If there's laws that provide the victim advocate privilege law or standard, then if the advocate has that 40-hour training that qualifies them to invoke the victim advocate privilege, then their records cannot be subpoenaed, their client files and so forth can't be subpoenaed, they're protected, just as a doctor-patient privilege or a lawyer-client privilege. So there are laws that protect that, and again, in terms of exercising our sovereignty, I think it's really important that tribes also look at developing such a law. System-based is really, there's no guarantee that they're not going to share information, because really their job as advocates is to be able to share information with the prosecutor, with law enforcement, with the hospital, because they're all working together on this criminal case. So that's important information for those that we're working with to know this information, that there's two different types. And again, knowledge is really empowering. So again, it's important to share this information with victim survivors. Next slide. So just some general information about advocacy in tribal communities. Like I said just a minute ago, in some states, there's a requirement that advocates receive 40-hour training, and in order to be protected by the victim advocate privilege. So you may want to look at your local laws, your state laws, and even your tribal laws if there's a provision for that. And if you need information about where to access those types of training, you could probably give us a call as well, or your local tribal coalition. There's some inherent differences, as I've already discussed, doing advocacy in tribal communities versus elsewhere. I've worked many years in mainstream as an advocate, so I know there is huge distinctions, and I'll share some of that. Resources are different. Often in tribal communities, you don't have as many resources, or the resources are remotely located and difficult to access. There generally hasn't been a lot of education on the issue of violence against women, so there's a little more hesitancy and unwillingness to really address the problems, or maybe some denial that the problems even exist. And also in tribal communities, we look at the jurisdictional complexities and the added responsibilities to educate non-native service providers. And this is huge. This is a huge difference from, it exists to some extent within mainstream advocacy programs, but I think not as much as it does in tribal communities when you have to deal with federal jurisdiction and and how that interplays with tribal and even state in some cases. So it makes the advocacy a little more daunting and demanding of us as advocates to get past some of those barriers of the jurisdictional complexities. Our communities are fairly small. Even if our reservations are huge, communities are small, and it makes confidentiality and privacy even more challenging because everyone seems to know everyone. So it becomes even more important that there are really sound policies around privacy and confidentiality. So the need for community education may be greater to achieve buy-in from the community, especially developing programs. You know, if your tribe does not receive OVW funding, chances are there's a need to provide education about the problem that exists so that people start to realize that these programs, tribally based programs, are really important given the level of violence that may be happening in a community. And also, you know, I always say that our community folks are like first responders, right? If a victim is going to disclose a sexual assault or domestic violence, they're probably going to turn to a relative or someone within their kinship system. So we want to be able to provide education to the community to make them good responders. And also, if we're creating programs or policy, we want to achieve buy-in from our community folks, and especially our tribal leaders. So it becomes really critical that we do our homework and do the community education as needed. Next slide. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, just because, you know, as I travel across Indian country, I realize that, you know, some of the philosophy of advocacy is sort of changing, or and not always in a good way. That I noticed that it's sort of like this original model of advocacy has somewhat evolved into maybe a more social service model or a more mental health model, and that really concerns me because, again, like I said, part of what we do in advocacy as Indian people, as relatives, is really about relationship building. It's really about invoking our tribal traditions and utilizing them as our ancestors did in order to survive a lot of the violence that was happening back then. And those are still strong today, our traditional ways and so forth. So I just want to share a few factors. It's important that we look at why violence occurs, like I said, and look at the root causes and continue to address those. Because, again, then we're looking at prevention. If we address things like gender equality, it's so critically important that we continue to do that as advocates. I'm going to just slide the whole. To understand the impact of violence on every individual, because, you know, even a physical assault in domestic violence isn't just a physical assault, that it goes much deeper than that. And then, you know, along with that, victims do need a sense of justice in order to heal, is my belief. And also the children who may witness the violence also need help and support in an age appropriate way, and also in a culturally appropriate way. You want to just pull down the whole thing. Understanding the basic tenet of advocacy is the empowerment of the victims who've been battered, raped, and stalked, so that we're always keeping that as a hallmark, the empowerment of victims. It's important that advocates know the resources in the community, do the legwork, meet with your non-tribal service providers, meet with your tribal service providers to see what their feelings are about these issues, so that you know firsthand what their understanding might be and how they respond to victims within their agencies. If they have policy or protocol, ask to see those things. and what I used to do as an advocate is anytime I was out with a woman in a particular setting, if something didn't work quite right, I would make note of it. And during our next staff meeting back at the organization, the agency, I would bring that up to say, this is what I encountered. How can we create some change around that? Because if it happened once, it's going to happen again. Because systems change work is an arm of advocacy, like I've been saying, to create social change through ongoing community education, and then also to create that vision of hope and healing for victims in the community, and building a broad base of community support through relationship building and regenerate values of taking care of one another as relatives. And that's so critically important when we talk about healing for victims, is that we're all on the same path, we're all on the same journey, because what affects one affects us all, and we all know about intergenerational and historic trauma. So this is really important, key to our work as advocates. Next slide. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly just to show you that there's differences. And within sexual assault, having been a sexual assault advocate for a number of years, really is probably falls more on the criminal side of doing legal advocacy. It's really about looking at gathering evidence for a criminal case, working with prosecutors, whether it's local or federal, or even tribal in some instances. So helping victims get medical attention to treat injuries, to receive emergency contraception, look at pregnancy prevention, and of course gather evidence to provide support, to remain with them at the hospital while they're getting that forensic exam, accompanying them to court or other kinds of appearances that they have to make, appointments they have to make, giving them the option of filing a criminal complaint even to begin with, and knowing what that looks like, helping them really understand what to expect. And this is part of that, giving them information so they can make an informed decision whether they even want to file a criminal complaint. And then following up with our advocacy and working with investigators and so forth to be able to provide good information back to the victim. Basic needs. Oftentimes we move right into services without thinking about, maybe she's concerned about her home or her children, or if they have enough food to eat and so forth. If the batterer left them with no financial resources, she may need basic needs for herself and her children if she has children. And then doing follow-up care as needed. And then also, I've seen that advocacy, including where I worked, advocacy agencies are often the center, the primary agency to coordinate responses, like a coordinated community response, a CCR, or a sexual assault response team. So oftentimes that's also the role of an advocate, is to bring those agencies together. And it sounds daunting, but it really is so worth it once you're able to do that. Next slide. And I just want to say safety is number one for all of these. Safety. And that's a key guiding question, when we do our work with advocates, always asking ourselves, how is this going to increase her safety? How is this going to jeopardize her safety, right? How can we create better policies here, a better response to ensure her safety? So safety should always be at the top of the list in our work as advocates. So when working with a domestic violence, information about who's the assailant, where is the assailant, what does he or she look like, does he or she have a car? So all this information is really important, so that, as we work with the victim, that we're also aware of that, because her safety, or the person we're working with, is important, as well as her children. But as advocates, our safety is important as well. Helping her seek medical attention as needed for herself or her children if that's warranted. Offering the option to file a criminal complaint, just the same as before, as I said, providing her with good information so she can make an informed decision. perhaps obtaining a protection order, and where is that going to be? Is it tribally based? Is it non-tribal? What are some of the challenges that she might experience? As well as working with those agencies so they become more culturally sensitive. And also her basic needs for housing, shelter, maybe changing her locks at her home, food, and so forth. Support and accompaniment to all her different agencies, and then follow-up care, as well as, like I said, being one of the driving forces behind a coordinated community response so that those agencies at the table are aware of the needs of the woman or the person that we're working with, her need for safety and better accountability. Next slide. As part of this project, we're also addressing teen dating violence that we hear so much about with our youth, and they're encountering this in their social settings, often with their partners. So these, again, are some of the roles that advocates have. It's being able to also work closely with school officials so that there's some safety measures that can be put in place, and also policies that the school might be able to implement to create safe places at school for the students, because legally the youth have to be at school. So it's important that school becomes safe from violence. Next slide. Stalking is also included in our training and technical assistance. Safety, again, is number one. To create awareness about the types of stalking that often we see, and those are some examples here. So educating the community about stalking. Oftentimes it's not taken seriously. It's like someone's interested in someone, so they're going to engage in some sexting. But it's really in the eyes of the beholder. If that person doesn't want that, then it's stalking. It's inappropriate. We also see a lot of this with battered women by their batterers who stalk them after they've filed for protection orders, for example. So we do safety planning, which is something we can do with all victims, sexual assault victims, domestic violence, and also stalking victims, to look at logging the stalking incidents, including date, time, location, method used, and then do some follow-up care as needed. So we continue to work with that victim to stop the stalking. There's a resource here that often has lots of really good information along with their website. Okay, just to recap, critical responsibilities for advocates. Again, we're really about victim empowerment and returning the autonomy to make choices back to the victim, and supporting the choices that the victim makes. So it's important that we have good information, we have accurate information about the options that are available to a victim, so that victim can make informed decisions and to be able to support those decisions. Sometimes that means the victim may even choose to return back to a batterer. Again, there should not be any kind of shaming associated with that, but really reminding the victim that we're concerned about her safety, and she is welcome to come back and utilize our services as many times as needed. Maintaining confidentiality is a cornerstone of safety, so having clear confidentiality policies and procedures is really critically important. Empowerment for victims is critical in the work of advocacy, and I've talked about this quite a bit, but I think it's so important. And then also for advocates to know the resources. To also, as you become familiar with all the resources in your community, look for the gaps. What are the gaps out there, and what can be done to meet those, to fill those gaps, whatever they might be. And like I said, it's really important that you become really familiar with your partners, your non-tribal and your tribal partners, to see how they do their work as far as the work that they do with victims. Is it based on an empowerment model? And if not, how can they change what they do to make it more victim sensitive, even more culturally appropriate if they're a non-tribal service provider? So as advocates, we have a lot of work, and it's really important to, again, like I said earlier, to keep ourselves safe as well. So there needs to be a support network, and to be able to look at where are we vulnerable, in what circumstances are we vulnerable when we take a woman to retrieve her belongings from her home. That's a really volatile time. So what are some of the safeguards in place? Making sure we have law enforcement support when we do that. For example, we have good information about what to expect so that there aren't any surprises, and we minimize that as much as possible. So those are some of the critical responsibilities. And again, this doesn't take the place of a 40-hour training, whether it's for domestic violence advocates or sexual assault advocates. So I encourage you to look into receiving more training, and if there's any way that we can help and you're not OVW funded, give us, contact us, and we can see what we can do. Okay? I'll turn it back over to Lana.
Thank you, Bonnie, for your presentation. I just wanted to point out to the right, you should see the 4 handouts that are available. One is the tribal letter describing this OVW initiative. We also have a training and technical assistance flyer. That is information about how to request training and technical assistance, as well as a link that you can fill out if you would prefer to do it online. There's also information about how to contact us on our website, as well as our email addresses. We also have a brochure that explains the various areas that we provide training and technical assistance. And then finally, you all received a PDF of the today's PowerPoint, and we will also be sending out a link to those of you who registered, including those who registered but may not have been able to make today's call. So in response to the additional resources that we have, so along with the advocacy, some of the materials that we have gained and have access to on our website under advocacy, we also have legal response, as well as shelter and safe housing. So we have all of those resources located on our website. Again, www.tribalresponse.org. We also have a connection or connect to our legal resources. And this is information regarding any questions that you may have pertaining to tribal protection orders. And if there are not, we have training and technical assistance available. So we have a number of those resources located on our website. Next slide. So this is how to contact us directly. Tribal Response at tlpi.org is the email address that will send an email to our training and technical assistance providers, as well as myself and others here at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, or you can contact me or Bonnie directly, and our email is located there on the screen. You can give us a call here in St. Paul, Minnesota, where we are located, and we also have a training and technical assistance request tool located on our website. Next slide. So I will turn it over to Abby if there are any questions for Bonnie.
We don't have any questions.
Great. Bonnie, did you have anything you wanted to say to close today?
No, I just support the work that advocates are doing. You're doing phenomenal work, and whether a victim survivor tells you that, or sometimes are challenging victims, but it's only because they've been through some challenging experiences. So just know that you are very valuable and very needed. Thanks for joining us today on our webinar.
Thank you, Bonnie. So I would say that concludes today's webinar. We have another webinar coming up next month on February 26th, and this is regarding shelter policies that are victim-centered and looking at how we set those up in our tribal communities, and that will be with Jermaine Omish-Lucero, who works with the Alliance for Tribal Coalitions to End Violence. We also have a Alaska Protection Order for March 18th, 2020, and that will be one of our presenters and our partners, the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, presenting on Alaska Tribal Protection Orders on March 18th, 2020. So I hope you can join us then. And again, this will be emailed to folks who were not able to join us today, but did sign up for today's webinar. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Abby, and have a great day.